My name is Nadine Moquena. I am 44 years old, and when my only son married a woman he had known for 7 months, I said nothing about the 73 million rand my late husband left behind. A number that converted to the dollars some of you are used to thinking in sits close to 4 million. But here in Soweto, we never called it that. We just called it what it was. Rand. Ours. Not one word did I say about it. Not to my son, not to his new wife, not to anyone. I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further, my drama family. I am not a woman who keeps secrets because I enjoy power. I keep them because I have learned the hard way over 20 years that silence is sometimes the only shield a woman like me is ever given. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk toward you smiling and felt somewhere low in your stomach that they were already counting what you had? 5 days after my son's wedding, that feeling arrived on my doorstep at 6 in the morning, wearing a woman's face and carrying a man's briefcase. Her name is Tasha, my daughter-in-law, and she came to my home with a man in a black suit holding a thick folder of documents before the sun had even finished rising over Orlando East. I want to slow down here because I think you deserve to see my life the way it actually was, not the way people assume it must have been once they hear a number like that. I still live in the same small brick house in Orlando East, Soweto, where Elijah and I raised our son. I could have moved to Santon years ago. I could have bought a house with a gate that swings open on its own and a kitchen island bigger than my first apartment. I never did. My neighbor Betty still waters my aloe plants when I travel. My porch swing still creaks the exact same way it's creaked since before Jordan could walk. He used to say it sounded like it was still complaining about something from another lifetime, and I never had the heart to oil it. Because some sounds are just home. Elijah Moquena was my husband for over 20 years. He had a heart attack 2 years ago, at 49, standing in the very warehouse he built with his own hands out of nothing but a rented storage unit and a stubborn belief that Soweto deserved its own building supply company instead of driving 40 minutes into the city for a bag of cement. Moquena Building Supplies. That name used to just be a sign over a door. Now it is the reason strangers smile at me a little too warmly at church. I had Jordan when I was 21, in our very first year together. I was young, I was in love, and I was in the eyes of Elijah's family simply the girl who got pregnant too soon and never finished anything. I want to tell you something I have never told another living soul outside of Pearl, my closest friend since we were 17. During our hardest year, the year we nearly lost everything, I quietly sold every piece of jewelry my late mother left me. Her wedding band, her gold bangles she wore to church every Sunday of my childhood. I sold all of it to make payroll for 6 employees who had families depending on them. And I never told Elijah where the money came from until years later, when we finally could afford to laugh about it over dinner. Elijah's brothers used to laugh about me at family gatherings, not always quietly. "Nadine only knows how to make babies early and sweep floors," one of them said once at a Christmas lunch while I was in the next room pouring juice for the children. I heard every word. I did not say anything. I never did. That is the woman Tasha walked into. She just didn't know it yet. The first time she ever visited our home before the wedding, back when she was still just Jordan's girlfriend to me, she asked to use the bathroom, and then she disappeared for almost 20 minutes. I didn't think much of it at first. People get lost in small houses sometimes. But later that evening, after they'd left, I walked into Elijah's old study, the room I still keep exactly as he left it, and I noticed his desk drawer wasn't quite closed the way I always leave it, just slightly crooked. The kind of thing only a woman who has dusted the same desk for 2 years straight would ever notice. When I went to close it properly, a small envelope slid forward and dropped to the floor. Inside was a piece of paper in Elijah's own handwriting, dated 3 years earlier, long before he ever got sick. It read, "If there ever comes a day when someone asks too many questions about the money from selling the company, remember, I left a codicil to the will that only the old attorney knows about. Don't trust easily." I sat down in the dark of that study holding that piece of paper and felt something cold move through me. In over 20 years of marriage, I thought I knew every layer of the man I loved. And here was proof that he had quietly built a shield for me, one I hadn't even known I would need. The night before the wedding, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It said only this: "You should look closely at your future daughter-in-law. She's been asking a lot of questions about the money from the company sale." I looked at that message. Then I looked again at Elijah's handwriting. And for the first time, the quiet unease I had been carrying for months turned into something with an actual shape. A real fear with a name. I did not delete the message. I did not tell Jordan. I simply placed that folded piece of paper back into our home safe, sat alone in the quiet of my kitchen, and asked myself one question that would follow me through everything that came next. How much longer could I keep this silence? Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning, 5 days after the wedding, because I want you to see it the way I saw it. Slow and ordinary, right up until it wasn't. It had rained overnight. I remember that clearly because the driveway was still dark and shining when I stepped outside just after 6 to bring in the empty bins, still in my robe, my slippers damp against the wet concrete. The birds were loud that morning, the way they get right after rain, and somewhere down the street, a taxi was idling its engine, coughing in the cool morning air. I was thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I had enough eggs for breakfast when a car I didn't recognize pulled up outside my gate. Tasha stepped out first, dressed sharp for 6 in the morning. Too sharp, if I'm honest, for a simple family visit. Behind her came a heavy-set man in a dark, shiny suit, a leather folder tucked under one arm like he was walking into a courtroom instead of my front garden. My hand tightened on the bin lid. Somewhere behind my ribs, my heart had already started answering a question my mind hadn't asked yet. I did not smile. I did not rush to unlock the gate. I simply stood there in the wet morning light, watching them approach, and felt the full weight of that folded piece of paper still sitting in my safe. Whatever this was, I understood one thing with total clarity. It was only the beginning. And this time, I would not be the only one keeping a secret. 2 weeks after the wedding, before that Tuesday morning ever happened, Tasha made a suggestion that seemed, on its surface, like nothing more than a practical kindness. "Why don't we just stay with you for a little while, Mama N?" she said, her hand resting lightly on Jordan's arm, her smile easy and warm. "It doesn't make sense to keep paying rent near Vitz when there's so much space here." I said yes. Not because I didn't feel a small warning bell somewhere in my chest. I did faintly, the way you feel a change in weather before the sky actually turns. I said yes because I loved my son, and because refusing would have meant explaining a suspicion I couldn't yet prove. Within the first week, Tasha had already begun helping me reorganize Elijah's old study. I found her there, on a Thursday afternoon sunlight cutting through the blinds, a cardboard box pulled down from the top shelf and set open on the desk. Across the side, in Elijah's own marker scrawl, it read, "Sale Documents, 2023. "I thought I'd scan everything and back it up to the cloud," she said brightly, not even looking up. "You know, just to be safe. Old paper like this can get damaged." I crossed that room faster than I have crossed any room in years. I took the box from her hands, gently, but firmly enough that there was no mistaking my meaning. And I said in a voice as calm as I could make it, "I'll take care of that myself, sweetheart." She smiled, but her eyes didn't. And as I set the box back on the shelf, I noticed something I would only understand the importance of much later. A torn corner of old letterhead caught between two folders. The kind of thin, formal paper a law office uses. I didn't think anything of it that day. I simply straightened the folders and told myself I'd sort through the box properly on my own time. That evening, while she still hovered near the study door, an old memory rose up in me uninvited, the way old wounds do. 8 years earlier, at a family gathering, I still remember in aching detail, Elijah's sister had announced, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that Nadine doesn't contribute anything to this family except sitting around enjoying herself. At that exact time, I was quietly pawning my personal savings account to cover my mother-in-law's ICU bill. I said nothing that day either. A few days later, I found something that changed the shape of everything. Tasha had left a small notebook behind on the kitchen table, forgotten in the rush of getting ready for work. I picked it up, only meaning to bring it to her room, but it fell open in my hands, and what I saw stopped me cold. It wasn't a planner. It was a list of names, young and middle-aged widows across Johannesburg, each one followed by a column marked simply, "Assets confirmed / not confirmed." My name sat on the fourth line. That same afternoon, Pearl came by for tea, the way she always does on a Wednesday. I showed her a photograph I had taken, almost by accident. Tasha standing outside Elijah's old warehouse, a building we still owned, but no longer actively used. Pearl went very still. "I saw her there last week," she said slowly, setting her cup down. "Standing in that exact spot, talking to a man in a hat. I thought he was family." Something inside me began quietly connecting itself, piece by piece. Tasha wasn't only curious inside my home. She had gone out deliberately to survey my late husband's old business. And every family has its quiet operators, the ones who treat love like an entry point instead of a bond. This was starting to feel less like a marriage and more like a heist dressed up in a wedding dress. I also want to tell you about a small thing I barely noticed at the time, though I think about it constantly now. A few days before, Tasha's younger sister, Aisha, had come along on one of the visits. Quiet the whole afternoon, picking at the hem of her sleeve. When Tasha mentioned, almost too casually, that it was such a shame Mama N doesn't trust anyone with her paperwork, I saw Aisha's eyes drop to the floor, her jaw tightening, like she wanted to say something and swallowed it instead. I thought it was shyness. I didn't yet understand it was conscience. I understand now what I couldn't fully name back then. Tasha wasn't simply greedy. She was a woman who had built her entire sense of safety around never again being the one without leverage. And a wedding ring was just the fastest door she'd found into a life she was terrified of not having. Underneath the calculation was something almost pitiable. The belief that love freely given could never be enough, that she had to engineer security because no one had ever simply handed it to her. That fear is real. It just doesn't excuse what she built on top of it. The next morning, I found my own tax return from the previous year sitting slightly out of place in the study. Photocopied the original, returned, but not quite where I'd left it. And beside it, half tucked under a folder, was a bank statement I kept in the same drawer. Its corner creased in a way that told me it had been photographed rather than copied. A phone held just above it, most likely close enough to catch the account number in the header. In the corner of the copied Pax page was a small smear of lipstick. Deep line red. The exact shade Pasha always wore. I stood in that study for a long, long time, understanding with total clarity that this was no longer suspicion. This was evidence. I did not call Jordan. I did not raise my voice, and I did not confront her at the door, though every part of me wanted to. I simply placed the photocopy into the same envelope that held Elijah's handwritten warning, and I thought to myself, they are getting closer. And I am not yet holding enough to make it matter. She found a list of widows with her own name written on it, and she still said nothing that night. Team Silent, she was right to wait and build real proof first. Team Speak, she should have confronted Tasha the moment she found that notebook. Drop a 1 for silent or a 2 for speak before you keep watching. I want to see which side of this drama family is bigger. In the days that followed, I did something I had never told anyone I was doing. Not Jordan, not even Pearl. Not at first. I drove into the city and sat down across from Elijah's old attorney, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Delamini, who had handled our affairs since before Jordan was born. I laid the envelope on his desk. I told him about the notebook of names. I told him about the lipstick on the tax return. And I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. If someone tried to prove I couldn't manage my own affairs, I said, what would stop them? He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a file I had never seen before. Elijah came to me 3 years ago, he said, and asked me to draft something very specific, a forfeiture clause, tied to Jordan's eventual marriage. If a spouse is proven through evidence, a court would accept, to have engaged in deception or asset-seeking behavior, or to have threatened your standing as the estate's rightful decision-maker, then that spouse's claim to any marital assets is void, and you, solely you, hold discretion as trustee. It was fully reviewed under our trust law. It will hold up. But Nadine, you'll need real evidence, not suspicion. Evidence a judge can look at. I left his office that afternoon with something I hadn't carried in weeks. Not comfort exactly. Direction. That is why, when Tasha called 2 days later to say she and a colleague wanted to come by Tuesday morning to talk about the future, I did not put her off. I let her come. Because, for the first time, I wasn't just waiting to be afraid. I was waiting to gather what I needed my drama family. And there is a particular kind of strength in choosing your battlefield instead of stumbling onto it. Sure enough, that morning I opened my banking app out of habit, the way I do every morning with my coffee, and saw something that stopped my hand mid-air. A failed login attempt. 2:17 in the morning. From an unrecognized device located in Santon. I thought immediately of that creased bank statement, the one I now understood had been photographed weeks before. I had already changed my passwords the day I found it. Whoever tried that login had come away with nothing. But it told me something important. They were still trying. They hadn't stopped digging. At 9 o'clock sharp, Tasha arrived with a man I would soon learn was named Reginald Hayes. A man I later discovered who had once practiced as an estate attorney before losing his license, and now made his living drafting paperwork for people who needed something to look official more than they needed it to be honest. They walked into my living room like they already owned the furniture. Reginald opened his leather folder and slid a proposal across my coffee table. 12 million rand transferred immediately to purchase a home worthy of the family's standing. 18,000 rand a month after that for ongoing support. It's simply family tradition, Tasha said, her voice honey smooth, to help the next generation get established. I declined, calmly, clearly. Her expression shifted just slightly, the sweetness thinning at the edges. Mama in, she said, tilting her head with something that almost looked like concern. People have mentioned you've been forgetful lately, a little tired. If you won't cooperate, We may have to consider guardianship arrangements, just to protect you." That single sentence landed like a blade in a wound I'd carried for 6 years. One I had never spoken of to another soul until this very telling. When Elijah first learned about his heart condition, his own sister-in-law had whispered to relatives, just loud enough for it to reach me, that Nadine's starting to lose it, so maybe we should manage the money for her. I swallowed that humiliation whole. I kept running the company. I kept nursing my husband, caring for his mother, minding her grandchild on weekends. I never defended myself once, and now here it was again, the exact same weapon, aimed at me from my own son's wife. Quietly, without a single change in my expression, I reached into my cardigan pocket and pressed record. Reginald leaned toward Tasha, lowering his voice just enough that he clearly believed I couldn't hear him. My phone heard every word. "The old codicil hasn't been revoked yet," he murmured. I ran the name through a contact at the registrar's office. If we can make this dementia angle stick, we might get it invalidated before probate even looks at it. In that whisper, I heard two very different kinds of fear collide. Reginald's was professional, a disbarred man's last hope of relevance chasing one final payday before the doors close on him for good. Tasha's was older and rawer. The terror of a woman who has never once believed she could be loved and secure at the same time. So she reached for control instead, mistaking my humiliation for her own safety. Neither of them understood that the very silence they were trying to exploit was the thing that had already outmaneuvered them. My blood went cold. Not because I hadn't expected this. Mr. Giuliani had warned me they might come looking, but because hearing it confirmed out loud in my own living room was different from suspecting it in the quiet of an attorney's office. I stood up. My voice came out level and absolutely final. "This conversation is over. Both of you need to leave my house." Tasha looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen before. The sweetness gone, entirely replaced by something sharper, colder, far more honest. After they left, I stood in my living room for a long time, my hand still curled tightly around my phone, the recording still saved. I called Mr. Giuliani and said only one sentence. "They just threatened to have me declared incompetent, and they know the codicil exists. I need everything ready before my son gets home." I sat down in Elijah's old chair by the window, looking out at the quiet street, and thought, they are prepared to take everything. The only question now is whether I can protect my son before he's pulled any further into this, and whether I can do it without breaking the one thing I still have left, to lose his trust in me. I have spent my whole adult life being underestimated. I have been called slow, forgetful, simple, lucky, anything but capable. And every single time I absorbed it, filed it away, and kept moving forward, because I understood something my husband's family never gave me credit for understanding. A woman who reacts immediately reveals everything she knows. A woman who waits reveals nothing at all. So I waited. But this time, waiting had a plan behind it. I had a recording. I had an attorney who already knew what was coming. And somewhere in a locked drawer, 30 minutes from my kitchen table, I had a piece of paper with my husband's handwriting on it, waiting for the exact moment it would matter most. Let them keep believing what they wanted to believe. Let them keep circling, certain that a quiet widow in a small brick house in Orlando East is an easy thing to move. They had never once asked what a quiet woman does with 20 years of practice staying silent and 3 weeks of quiet preparation behind her. Jordan came home earlier than expected that afternoon. His department meeting had been abruptly canceled, and he pushed open the front door to find me sitting motionless in his father's chair, my phone still glowing in my lap. The recording paused mid-playback. I didn't say much. I simply handed him the phone and pressed play. He listened to Tasha's voice raise the subject of guardianship. His jaw tightened. Then came Reginald's whisper about the codicil, and Jordan nearly dropped the phone entirely. He stood up slowly, his voice rough. "I'm going to go upstairs for a minute." Upstairs, Tasha had left her bag and phone in the bedroom while she went down to the kitchen. The screen was still unlocked. Jordan opened it, not out of habit, but out of a need to know, finally, who he had actually married. He found a group chat titled, "Johannesburg Legacy Plan." 4 members. One message from Tasha read, "This widow is young and living too simply. She has to be hiding money somewhere. The weak, forgetful strategy will definitely work this time." In the deleted folder, Jordan recovered a voice note Tasha had sent to her sister Aisha, recorded just 2 days before the wedding. Tasha's voice flat and rehearsed. "If the mother refuses, we go with the dementia angle. I've practiced it in the mirror already. People say you've been forgetful. It sounds completely natural." Jordan sat down on the floor of that bedroom, his head in his hands. For the first time, he understood that his entire marriage had been a performance, rehearsed in advance down to the last syllable. What broke in Jordan in that moment wasn't only love, it was identity. He had built a version of himself around being the man who chose well, who saw people clearly, who wouldn't repeat the mistakes he'd watched happen in other families. Hearing that rehearsed voice note wasn't just proof of his wife's deception. It was proof that his own judgment, the thing he trusted most about himself, had been quietly overridden for months. That's a harder thing to grieve than the marriage itself. The house phone rang. Not a cell phone, the old landline in the hallway. The one Elijah had insisted on keeping, for emergencies. The one that almost never rang anymore. Jordan told me later that the sound of it startled him so badly, he nearly knocked over the lamp getting to it. It was Aisha, sobbing on the line, her breathing uneven, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has been holding something in for far too long and finally lets it go, all at once. She confessed that her sister had run the exact same scheme on a young widow in Pretoria the year before, and had very nearly succeeded. "I should have said something that day at your house," she told Jordan, her voice breaking. "I almost did. I've felt sick about it for weeks." I thought hearing Jordan repeat this to me later, of Aisha sitting quietly at my kitchen table weeks earlier, picking at the hem of her sleeve, her eyes dropping to the floor when Tasha made that comment about my paperwork. I had read it as shyness then. It had been conscience the whole time, straining against loyalty to a sister she clearly loved and clearly feared disappointing. Then Aisha sent something else through WhatsApp. A photograph taken without anyone's knowledge of Tasha and Reginald sitting together in a coffee shop in Sandton City. The date stamp read, 4 months before Jordan ever proposed. Jordan stared at that photograph for what he said felt like a full minute, though it was probably 10 seconds. Tasha's hand was resting on the table near Reginald's folder in the image, not touching him, nothing improper in that sense, but close, familiar. The posture of 2 people already mid-conversation about something they'd discussed before. He said it was the folder that undid him more than anything else. The same kind of folder Reginald had carried into our living room that morning. Which meant this hadn't started with our family. It had started long before Jordan ever said a single vow, and he had simply been the door they walked through to get to what they wanted. He came back downstairs and called Tasha into the living room. His voice was low and colder than I had ever heard it. "You have 20 minutes to explain yourself before I call a lawyer." Tasha tried to deny everything at first. She cried real tears, or tears that looked real enough that I found myself, despite everything, briefly uncertain. She claimed she'd been misunderstood. She even tried to turn the blame toward me, insisting I had never liked her from the start. But when Jordan played the voice note and then showed her the photograph, something in her shifted entirely. I watched it happen in real time. The exact moment a person stops performing because they've finally understood the performance has failed. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her chin, which had been tilted up in practiced defiance, came down level. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, quick and unglamorous. Nothing like the composed woman who had walked into my house that morning and looked directly at me. And her voice turned sharp as glass. "You think you're so noble sitting there in silence," she said. "Everyone in this family already knows you dropped out of nursing school and got treated like hired help by Elijah's own people. Jordan's going to hear it from someone eventually. Might as well be from me." It was cruel. It was meant to wound. But it wasn't the secret I feared her having, and something in me steadied at that she had gossip. She did not have my whole life. The room went cold anyway. Jordan stepped between us, not dramatically, just a simple shift of his body, angling himself half a step in front of me, the way he used to do without thinking when we crossed busy streets together as a boy, his hand automatically finding mine at the curb. He didn't look at his wife anymore. He looked only at me and said quietly, "Mom, don't say anything. Let me handle this." I want to pause here and tell you what that moment actually felt like, because I don't think words like betrayal quite capture it. There is a particular kind of pain in hearing old family gossip thrown at you like a weapon, dressed up as if it were new information, as if it could still shame you the way it once did. But here is what I noticed, sitting very still in that chair, watching Tasha's face as she spoke. She was afraid. Underneath the sharpness, underneath the performance of righteous anger, she was a woman who understood in that exact moment that the ground beneath her had already started to give way. People who are winning do not reach for old family rumors. They reach for that only when they have nothing solid left to stand on. I did not open my mouth, not because I had nothing to say, because I finally understood with total clarity that I had something far more powerful than an argument sitting in a drawer less than 10 feet away. This wasn't just my drama family's story to watch unfold anymore. For Jordan, it was his whole life splitting open in one afternoon. We sat there for a moment, the three of us, in a silence so heavy I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room, and somewhere far off, a dog barking twice and going quiet. Tasha's chest rose and fell too quickly. Reginald, still hovering near the doorway, with his folder now hanging loosely at his side, instead of tucked importantly under his arm, looked for the first time since I'd met him that morning like a man who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. It was Jordan who finally broke it. He turned to Reginald and said very quietly, "Get out of my mother's house." And then to Tasha, without raising his voice at all, which somehow made it worse, "We're done talking today. Tomorrow, we talk with lawyers in the room." I did not let Jordan call the police that night. I called Mr. Lamini first. He arrived within the hour, carrying a file he had already begun preparing the day I first reported the guardianship threat. The evening had turned gray and close by then, the kind of stillness that comes before high-felt rain, and I remember the light in the living room going dim enough that Jordan reached over and switched on the lamp beside his father's chair without being asked. A small, automatic kindness, the kind that told me, even in the middle of everything, that he was still thinking of me before himself. Tasha remained seated in my living room, her expression somewhere between fury and fear. She had gone very quiet by then. Her earlier sharpness folded back in on itself, replaced by the stillness of someone doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. Reginald hovered near the door, restrained now by nothing more than the attorney's calm, unwavering presence, and the growing certainty that he had badly misjudged this family. Mr. Dlamini did not raise his voice, not once. He simply set his briefcase down on the coffee table with the quiet authority of a man who has done this exact thing many times before, opened it, and asked Tasha and Reginald politely whether they wished to have their own legal representation present before anything further was discussed. Reginald said nothing. Tasha's eyes flicked toward the door, then back, then down at her own hands, which she had folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had gone pale. I walked to the safe in Elijah's study and returned with a thin folder Mr. Dlamini had brought over that very week, freshly certified. My hand, I noticed, was completely steady on the handle of that folder. Steadier, I think, than it had been in weeks. Because whatever was coming next, I finally had something solid to hold instead of only fear. I set it down on the coffee table, opened it to the marked page, and read it aloud, slowly, in front of Tasha, Reginald, Jordan, and my attorney. Per the codicil to the will of Elijah Mokwena, properly executed and witnessed on the 14th of March, 3 years ago, and reviewed under South African trust law, should any spouse of Jordan Mokwena be shown through evidence sufficient to satisfy a court to have engaged in deceptive conduct or asset-seeking behavior toward this estate, or to have threatened the standing of its rightful trustee, all marital claims to estate assets are forfeited. Discretion in such a determination rests with the named trustee, Nadine Mokwena, subject to standard judicial review. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear Tasha's breath catching in her throat. She stared at that page as though it were a blade pointed directly at her chest. Every plan, every threat, every fabricated accusation collapsed into something very small in that instant. I watched the color leave her face in stages, the way a shadow moves across a wall as the sun goes down. First her cheeks, then her lips, until she looked almost gray under the lamplight. Watching her in that silence, I didn't see a mastermind anymore. I saw a woman whose entire plan had been built on the assumption that a quiet widow had nothing behind her but grief, and who had never once considered that grief and preparation could live in the same person. Her collapse wasn't really about the money. It was the moment she realized the story she'd told herself about who I was had been wrong from the very beginning, and there was no version of her ambition that could survive being that wrong. Reginald's face drained of color. He understood far too late exactly how badly he had underestimated the woman sitting across from him, and exactly how thoroughly her attorney had closed every door he'd been counting on to stay open. I noticed his hand drift toward his own folder on the table, then stop as if he'd realized there was nothing left inside it worth reaching for. Tasha shot to her feet, jabbing a finger toward me. "You set this up from the very beginning!" I looked at her calm and unhurried. "I only stayed quiet," I said. "You're the one who walked into your own trap." Mr. Dlamini informed them both without a trace of hesitation that he would immediately file to have the marriage annulled on grounds of premeditated fraud under South African law, supported by the recording, the voice note, the photograph, the group chat, and Aisha's willingness to give a statement. Tasha left the house before midnight, and by morning, she had stopped answering Jordan's calls entirely. Reginald, we later learned, left Johannesburg within days, likely aware that a disbarred attorney caught assisting in an asset fraud scheme was facing far more than embarrassment. The court process took a little over 2 months, from filing to final judgment. Not instant, but fast enough given the strength of the evidence and the clear forfeiture language Elijah had put in place years before anyone needed it. I want to tell you about those 2 months because they were not dramatic. They were slow and strange, and in their own way, harder than the confrontation itself. Jordan moved back into his childhood bedroom without either of us discussing it out loud. It simply happened, the way water finds the lowest point. Some evenings we barely spoke. I would make tea for two out of habit, before remembering, most nights, that it was only ever going to be the two of us drinking it. Other evenings, he would sit across from me at the kitchen table while I went through Elijah's old ledgers, not really helping, just present the way a person sits with someone in a hospital waiting room, not because there's anything useful to do, but because being alone with it would be worse. Once near the end of that waiting period, he asked me out of nowhere whether I had ever been afraid that I was wrong about her. I told him the truth, that I had been afraid of many things in those weeks, but never that. A mother does not always know her son's heart, but I had spent 20 years learning to read a room the way some people read a book, and I had read that woman's questions, her too quick smiles, her habit of finding reasons to be alone in rooms that weren't hers, and none of it had ever once read as love. When the ruling finally came, the marriage was declared void from its inception, as though it had never legally existed at all. Jordan insisted on paying off every credit card debt and wedding expense Tasha had opened in his name, entirely on his own. He refused any help from me, saying quietly that this particular debt was his to carry alone. Not the money, he said, but the lesson. He wanted to pay for that himself. In the weeks that followed, I watched my son change in ways that both broke my heart and mended it at the same time. He stopped sleeping through the night for a while. He would sit on the porch swing long after I had gone to bed, staring out at nothing, replaying, I imagine, every small moment of his short marriage, searching for the seams he should have noticed. Some nights, I would wake to the faint, familiar creak of that swing through my bedroom window, and lie there, listening to it. The same sound that used to mean a small boy rocking himself to sleep after a bad dream, now meaning something heavier, that I couldn't rock away for him anymore. I never pushed him to talk. I simply left a cup of rooibos tea on the small table beside him most evenings, and let him find his own way back to himself. One evening, about 3 weeks after the annulment was finalized, he finally asked me the question I had been waiting for. How long did you know Mom before I found out myself? I told him the truth, about the crooked drawer, about the envelope, about the lipstick on the tax return and the notebook full of names. I told him about the text message the night before his wedding and how I had chosen again and again not to speak until I had something a court could actually use. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Why didn't you just tell me?" Because, I said, a mother's suspicion is not proof, and I was not going to destroy your marriage on a feeling, even one that turned out to be right. I needed the truth to stand on its own so that no one could ever tell you afterward that your mother simply never liked her. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon, I saw something like relief settle into his shoulders. He reached over and squeezed my hand once the way his father used to, and said nothing else. Some things don't need more words than that. 3 months after the marriage was declared void, Jordan and I sat together in Elijah's old study, the same room where all of this had quietly begun. The afternoon light came through the blinds in the same thin gold stripes it always had, and for a moment, watching dust drift slowly through it, I thought of Tasha standing in this exact spot with that cardboard box in her hands, and how far away that moment already felt. We decided together to use a portion of the estate's earnings to establish a scholarship fund in his father's name, the Elijah McQuena Community Builders Fund, dedicated to supporting young students from difficult backgrounds studying construction, small business, and engineering at the University of the Witwatersrand. He built everything out of one small rented storage unit, Jordan said quietly, running his hand along the edge of his father's old desk. Now we get to help other people build something too. The fund's first recipient, we learned that spring, was a 19-year-old from a township not far from our own, studying structural engineering, with hopes of one day running his own contracting company. When the letter came confirming his acceptance, Jordan read it out loud at the kitchen table, and I found myself thinking that Elijah, wherever he was, would have liked that young man very much. We drove out to the small award ceremony together, the two of us, on a bright, windless Saturday morning. I remember the folding chairs set up in rows on the university lawn, the slight squeak of the podium microphone before someone adjusted it, and the young man's mother in the second row pressing a handkerchief to her mouth as her son's name was called. Jordan stood to shake his hand afterward, and I watched something in my son's posture straighten that I hadn't seen since before the wedding. Not performance, just quiet, ordinary pride, the kind that asks for nothing in return. 6 months later, Jordan began seeing someone new, a 29-year-old community organizer named Imani, who worked on social housing projects across Soweto. She drove an old, dented car. She dressed simply, without a hint of performance, and in all the time I came to know her, she never once asked either of us about money. She only ever asked about Elijah, what he was like, what he believed in, what made him laugh. The first time she came to dinner, she arrived with a small bag of nutgeese from a stall near her office, insisting they were the best in Soweto, and sat at my kitchen table peeling one with her fingers instead of a knife, laughing at herself when the juice ran down her wrist. It was such a small thing, but I remember sitting across from her, watching Jordan watch her, and feeling something in my chest loosen that had been tight since that Tuesday morning at the gate. There was no folder in her bag. There was no careful angle to her questions. There was only a woman peeling a nutki and asking with real curiosity whether Elijah had liked his tea sweet or plain. One Sunday afternoon, Jordan and I sat together on the stone steps at Constitution Hill, looking out over the wide, uneven skyline of Johannesburg. The wind was cool, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. Somewhere behind us, a street vendor was calling out prices for roasted mealies, and further down the hill, a group of school children in matching jerseys were laughing at something none of us could hear clearly. Jordan reached over and took my hand quietly, the way he used to as a small boy crossing the street. "I understand now," he said, "why you stayed silent through all of it. It was never fear, was it?" I didn't answer right away. I simply held his hand a little tighter and let my eyes settle on the horizon, the jacaranda trees just beginning to bud early that year, the glass towers catching the last of the afternoon light, the whole restless, beautiful city Elijah had loved enough to build something inside of, one bag of cement at a time. To everyone watching this unfold from the outside, my drama family, it probably looked like patience. From the inside, it felt more like survival with good manners. In my mind, I heard Elijah's handwriting again, the words he had left me 3 years before any of this ever began. Don't trust easily. I think if he were sitting on that step with us, he would have added one more line. Not instead of that one, alongside it. But trust the ones who stay quiet with you and still stay. This story reminds us that a quiet woman is not a foolish one, and that grief does not make you weak. It only makes you tired in places other people can't see. If you are a widow reading a bank statement alone at your own kitchen table tonight, here's something practical, not poetic. Call your attorney this month, not someday, and ask plainly whether your accounts and property are titled the way you believe they are. Many women only discover they aren't after it's too late to fix. Quietly. If a new son-in-law or daughter-in-law starts asking detailed questions about your finances before the wedding cake is even ordered, that is not you being paranoid. That is information, and it is allowed to make you cautious. Keep one folder, one drawer, one person outside your own children who knows the whole shape of your finances. Because love can make even careful people slow to see danger clearly. And when your children finally ask why you waited to tell them something hard, you do not owe them an apology for protecting them at the pace you could actually manage. Pour your coffee. Water your own garden. Keep your own name on your own documents. That was Nadine's real inheritance. Not the 73 million, but the quiet habit of protecting herself long before anyone else noticed she needed to.